Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here with us. You heard a little bit of our chit chat to start the show, but it's an exciting evening, and we're very welcome to have, we're very happy to have a distinguished guest with us tonight, Dr. Jeanne Sheehan. Um, just a quick word on the format for this evening. Uh, I, Dr. Michael Crowder, the public historian of the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, will conduct this as a conversation between Dr. Sheehan and myself. We encourage you to, those in the audience, the attendees, to ask questions during the conversation, which will be about an hour or so. And then we plan to leave 30 minutes for a Q&A from the audience. So we encourage you to ask questions. You can either do so through the Q&A function at the bottom, or you can type questions into the chat function at the bottom of your screen as well. So please feel free to do so as we are in the midst of our conversation, and we'll certainly make sure that we get to everybody's questions by the end of this evening. So, having given you our programming notice, welcome to the monthly Quaff and Quill co-produced collaboration between the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies here at Iona College and the Huguenot and New Rochelle Historical Association in the Thomas Paine Cottage, just down the street from us at Iona College. And before I introduce our distinguished guest, I want to now ask Mr. Gary Burton to talk a little bit about the Thomas Paine Cottage and the Huguenot and New Rochelle Historical Association. So Gary, please introduce these organizations.
Okay. Thomas Paine Cottage and Museum is located right next to the Paine Monument on North Avenue, if you're not familiar with it. It has regular events, hopefully in person coming up soon. This is the 6th in a series of book talks that we've had. The first 3, I believe, were live, and the next 3 were is going to be Zooms. Next month, we have another one. Dr. Francis Chu from New School has a book on the rights of man, and which is excellent as well. And that will be interesting. The cottage holds this series to give awareness to their events and their activities. My association, the Thomas Paine National Historical Association, supports their efforts at the cottage, and we'll be working closer together in the future. We will be posting a place where you can send in your donations for this. This is free of charge, but we welcome donations to the cottage, and we need that money to, they need that money to function. So please be generous. That's it for now. I'll be talking later.
All right, thank you, Gary. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our, I keep using the word distinguished, but it's the only word I can think of to describe you, Dr. Jeanne Sheehan, professor of political science at Iona College. Dr. Sheehan specializes in public sector, government, and media and entertainment. Her resume is large, and it's very varied. She's written a couple of books, including the one that we're here to discuss tonight, American Democracy in Crisis, The Case for Rethinking Madisonian Government. Dr. Sheehan's also a widely sought after speaker and moderator at universities, nonprofit organizations, corporate institutions, and conferences across the world. In addition to her work at Iona, those of us in the New Rochelle community will probably, I'm sure, recognize Dr. Sheehan for her frequent contributions to a large number of television and cable outlets. Just a couple of those are Fox News, MSNBC, Headline News, CNN, BBC, CBS, and on and on and on. And we are so happy to have you today, Dr. Sheehan. And just to get the conversation started, what was the impetus for writing this book, American Democracy in Crisis? What sort of led you to this topic, and what inspired you to tackle this subject?
So I want to thank you, Michael, and everybody at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, including our colleague Nora Slominski, and of course, everybody at Gary Burton and everybody at the Thomas Paine Cottage. You've been incredibly supportive, and I'm really, thrilled to be here as one of your author events. So the book is a long time coming. As you know, these things are. I've been working on this book in various capacities for several years. I would say almost since I was a doctoral student. But I think in the last several years, the impetus really was questions I was consistently getting from people. I am not a historian, I am a political scientist, as you said. And so I constantly hear from people, what is wrong with our government? How can we make it better? Why are people so frustrated? The polls show the American public is roundly discouraged with their government. So I get a lot of questions on that. And for years, I had been teaching this book without the book. And so I decided to put it in book form. And one of the things that students always ask me, the subtitle of the book, as you said, is the case for rethinking Madisonian government. And students will always say, this is a political science course. Why are we talking about James Madison so much? And my answer is because you can't understand American government and politics today and what works about it and what doesn't, unless you understand how it was structured, because I really at heart am a structuralist. And we live in a system, if you live in the United States, that has almost not changed at all structurally, except around the edges from the time Madison and the framers created it, which is rare. It has changed very little. So I always make the case, you can't understand what's going on unless you understand the structure. And just to give you an example, in the last several days, we have all been reeling from the horrific incidents in Georgia and Colorado. I almost feel like I am on some kind of treadmill. I go on TV or radio and we say the same things over and over. We have the president out saying there should be common sense gun reform. We have Congress holding hearings. That's been the same thing after all these horrific events. One of the things I cite in my book is that in 1982, former Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon gave a speech at Tufts University in which he decried the amount of gun violence in the United States. That was 1982. Since that time, we have had 9 of the 10 deadliest shootings in American history, and the government has not passed at the federal level common sense sustainable gun control. And one of the things Dillon said in that speech was, that's despite the fact that 3/4 of Americans support it. 2019, Pew does a study, 88% of Americans support expanded gun checks, expanded background checks, 82% of those being Republicans. So we're always told in the media that, and commonly, that we don't have agreement. There's a lot of disagreement. There is, but there's also a lot of agreement on things like expanded background checks. And nevertheless, we don't get it done at the federal level. And this book is my attempt to answer that question as to why. And I don't want to be a reductionist and say there's one reason, but to me, the biggest factor is that our system is structured against making policy that is in the interest of the majority. And so that has been true from the founding, and I think it's true today. So that's my very long-winded answer to your simple question.
Well, thanks very much. I mean, as I read your book, it's one of the things that I learned the most about is the bridge that you make between the founding era, the era of the revolutionary era, and the quote unquote founders, and folks like James Madison, and the politics of today. And it is fascinating to think about, and perhaps a little sobering to think about how the apathy, which you just mentioned in your comment, but which is, I think, pretty, for those of us just living in the world, that we see that apathy with especially national politics, and it brings me to one of your second major themes in the book, which I'd like to hear you talk about a little bit more, which is about how democracy, both as a political science term and as a practical reality of the representative republic that is the United States governmental structure, about how that word democracy is understood both at the founding moment and how those ideas about democracy continue to inform today's politics.
One of the fascinating things when we ask most Americans how you define democracy, what is democracy? One of the most common thoughts that comes up is that it has to do with separation of powers. And that is not surprising because we live in a system that is separated, and we have so much division in this system. And I'm not talking partisan division, I'm talking structural division by design. So for Americans, it's common to assume that all democracies have this much separation in them. And that's simply not the case. Our framers, James Madison and the other framers, followed Montesquieu. And their contention and Montesquieu's contention in Spirit of the Laws was that if you want to protect liberty, the best way to do that is to separate power. And so, you know, I like to say that Madison took Montesquieu's idea and it's on steroids. He not only adopts separation of powers, they add to that checks and balances, they add to that federalism, they add to that bicameralism. Every division you can think of. And of course, their goal is protect liberty. So when we think about our framers, we need to define them as what they were. They were protectionists. They thought that the goal of government, of free government, should be to protect liberty. And one thing I don't think we recognize a lot is that for our framers, they had a concept of ordered liberty. Not all liberties were equal. And for the framers of the US Constitution, the current and the second one, of course, was property. That was what they were trying to protect. That was, if you read Federalist 10 carefully, what Madison described as the ultimate most important liberty, and everything else paled in comparison. So they designed a system to protect liberty, and to them that meant dividing power. You know, I am a civil libertarian. I too would like to protect liberty, but one of the points I try to make in the book, and by the way, I should put this in context, I am not alone. This case has been made going back into the 1800s, if not the late 1700s, is that in the interest of protecting liberty, what they did was they diminished governmental responsiveness to the majority and accountability. And so one of the sort of mantras I have is, can we do a better job, not just protecting liberty? Let's protect liberty, certainly, but let's also make the government a bit more responsive to the majority and a bit more accountable to the people. Because when you see those out of whack, people rightly get frustrated. And that's, you know, to go back to gun control or the crisis of immigration, you know, when decade after decade, the government is not acting on a crisis, people have every right to be frustrated. And what they do, and this is human nature probably, is they either tune out, they seek some kind of salvation with a demagogue who promises to fix the system, or they turn to violence. And that was one of the striking things. I wrote a lot of this book during the pandemic. And obviously, as we've seen, some of the Black Lives Matter protest into the January 6th. And one of the things that has always concerned me was that if people get fed up enough and they turn to violence, or they check out completely, or they start following demagogues, we have a real problem on our hands. And so, and again, I want to say this is an argument been made, I'm just resurrecting an argument that's been made going back to, you know, Joseph Story in the 1830s, if not earlier.
Well, thank you. And that, so that sort of leads me to the next question I have, and it's the term that's in the subtitle of your awesome book. Sorry if you can't see that behind my screen, but the case for rethinking Madisonian government, and that's obviously a reference to James Madison, the so-called father of the Constitution, as most people in the United States know today. And you talked a little bit about this, but if you could just talk a little bit more directly, what exactly does Madisonian government mean, both in a historical context, but also translated into 21st century politics and certainly addressing issues like you just mentioned with gun ownership, immigration, et cetera, all the sort of quote unquote hot button issues that are hotly debated today.
You know, I think of Madisonian government as a form of democracy. So if we define democracy very simply as a government in which the people have some power, the question then becomes, what type of democracy? Is it one in which they have, you know, total power, or is it one in which they have some limited power and a limited voice? So if you think of it as a spectrum, there's, you know, a lot of possibilities. And as we know, our framers decided, and again, to raise Federalist 10, there's a reason it's the most popular Federalist paper. That's James Madison's defense of choosing a republic or a Republican form of democracy, which at that time was not, you know, had never existed, you know, except in a small way, had never existed over a large extended republic. When people at the time thought of democracy, they thought of a pure or direct democracy like the Greek city-state. And Madison in Federalist 10 makes a case for Republican democracy. And the reason he says we need a Republican democracy in part is because he says the greatest danger to a free state is what he says are factions. And these are groups of people with a common interest and a shared passion who are motivated to join together and to pursue their common interests. He says there's two kinds. There's minority factions, and in a democracy, we don't worry so much about those because they can't take over. But he says majority factions are the biggest threat to a free state because you can't get rid of them, because to get rid of them would be to get rid of democracy altogether. Nor, he says, can you force people to have shared interests because that violates human nature. So he says you can't get rid of these majority factions, so you've got to control their effects. And that's his defense of a Republican form of democracy. And, you know, coupled with the fact he says a direct democracy can't work over a large extended republic at the time. You know, this is something that Ross Perot and other people, as we get new technology, will say, hey, maybe we can do this now. But at the time, he made the case we couldn't do it. But what was driving that in large part with Madison was what had happened under our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and the fact that at the state level at the time, they saw poor people, they saw people without education, people without means, starting to get power at the state level. And when they were getting that power, there was a real threat that they would then start to think about things like, maybe we should take property from people of means and wealthy people and landowners and redistribute it. You know, maybe we should redistribute wealth. And that's in large part what drives our framers to call for our current, you know, the convention that results in our current Constitution. And so when I think of Madisonian democracy, I think of not only a Republican democracy, but one in which power is divided to ensure, as far as possible, that majorities cannot come together and take steps against minorities. And that can be a very good thing. The problem is that he succeeds so well that now, even when majorities we may like to have a voice in government, have a very difficult time. And so if you think about something like healthcare reform, you know, it takes us 100 years to get healthcare reform in this country, and it's not even particularly satisfying when it comes out. And why is that? Because we have such a divided system that minority voices can shut down majorities in our system very, very quickly. And of course, we're seeing this debate today. The framers did not invent the filibuster. It's not in the Constitution, of course, but it reflects this idea that is sort of a shared ethos in our system, that minorities should have an outsized voice. And again, we want to protect minority rights and we want to protect liberty, but governments have to be able to address key crises. And when they can't do that in a timely manner, and when people don't know who to hold accountable, you do have a problem on your hands. And I think that's where we are right now and have been for some time.
Yeah, thank you. It's speaking about factions and the context of this Madisonian Republican Democratic political system. Faction being the 18th century word, right, for political party. I think many of us know, or it's a fairly well-known historical fact that the founders and the Constitutional Convention created this document, the Constitution, not anticipating the rise of political parties in the 1790s. And the political parties play a fascinating role in your book from the 18th century and the rise of the first two quote unquote factions or parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, of course, all the way till today. Today is Republicans and Democrats. Can you talk a little bit about how the rise of political factions or political parties complicated the ideas of a Madisonian Republican democracy? Because it strikes me that in reading your book, parties, I think we sort of view them the same way today, possibly as those in the early 19th century did, which is that they're necessary evils, perhaps, or they're obstacles, perhaps, in many cases, to lasting change. Can you talk a little bit more about how the rise of political parties sort of fits into your story here in this book?
And that's the very phrase that comes to mind, is a necessary evil. You know, as I mentioned, James Madison expresses what is a common sentiment of the day in Federalist 10 when he describes factions or political parties as the greatest threat to a free state. And of course, probably more famously or equally famously is George Washington's farewell address, in which he makes very much the same case. And so it is curious then that it is not long after the founding that the same men who were describing these in such, negative terms as such an evil, turn to them. And of course, I can only describe it as the difference between sort of what you may ideally want to happen and the reality of governing. And particularly the reality of governing in a system as divided as ours. So while James Madison says they are a greatest threat in Federalist 10, he very quickly forms together with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, obviously on the other side, and they move into this era of the first party system. And I think in the simplest terms, it's not necessarily a choice. They had no other option. The system was so divided that if they wanted to get anything done, and Alexander Hamilton did, and James Madison did, and Thomas Jefferson, and all of them, they had to form coalitions of like-minded people, and they had to move forward. And they had to do that not only at the governing level, they had to do it at the electoral level as well. And political parties become obviously a major component of our system. And, political scientists are famous for defending political parties. And, it's a curious thing because going back to our founding, if not before, they are decried as, as immoral and problematic from every perspective. And they certainly have been corrupt and corrupting. They have not been responsible. And yet I always ask students, if not for political parties, then what? You either have to remove the divides in the system, in the structure, or you have to find a way to link people together to get things done. And political parties are not the only option for doing that, but they're the one our framers, settled on. And other examples are interest groups. They can be used to move policy forward. And yet the common idea with interest groups is they are, usually sort of something that people in the upper and middle classes turn to, and they leave aside the lower classes. So they haven't been seen as a great option for that reason. But I think that's where political scientists in the United States in particular, but elsewhere as well, have commonly said, yes, parties are problematic. But if you're not going to turn to them, you've got to explain how you're going to move policy forward. If we think today, President Biden wants to move forward his Build Back Better plan, his big infrastructure plan, $3 to $4 trillion. And obviously, we don't know if he's going to be able to do that successfully. They've passed H.R. 1, the Voting Rights Act. These things are passed because coalitions of people are working together in the form of parties to do that. At least they are, moved towards passage. So in our system so divided, they're essential to getting that work done. And I think that's sort of one of the ironies of our framers and the system, is that they decried them, and at the same time they turned to them because they had no other good options to turn to when they needed to do all the things they needed to do at the beginning to set up our system of government.
Thank you. And hearing you talk a little bit more about political parties or factions reminds me of, and you discuss this in your book, James Madison's sort of shift in the early and mid 1790s from being a Federalist to being a Democratic Republican, and in a short amount of time. And it shows us the fluidity of this founding moment, and certainly the political fluidity of the most important political theorist of the day, James Madison. And as I was reading your book, I couldn't help but think, so in a magical world where James Madison could be transported to today, to 21st century America, what do you think he would say? What do you think his observations would be if he could see the system that he helped to create, and arguably had the largest hand in creating in the Constitution, and the way that it's unfolded over the 2+ centuries?
One of the fascinating things, many fascinating things about James Madison, is that he had the largest hand potentially in constructing the Constitution. Certainly he was not alone, but we do refer to him, as you mentioned, as the father of the Constitution. And one of the sort of famous ideas about James Madison is he could write the Constitution, but he couldn't govern under it. And I think that's important to remember. He obviously became president after Thomas Jefferson exited after 2 terms, and he had a very difficult time in the presidency. And I think that gives you a clue as to what he might think about where we are today. He understood at the time he was governing how difficult it is, particularly in the from the executive branch, to govern in our system. He was in the legislature prior to that, and he was an incredibly successful legislator. He was not a very good president, as we all know. And so I think that tells you a little bit about why in around 1816, he echoes what is a very common statement by our framers, both during the convention, shortly after, all the way through to when they started to pass away, which was this idea that we did the best we could, but the system is not perfect. And I know, as we're here at, with the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies and Thomas Paine Cottage, Thomas Paine had quite a history with Gouverneur Morris. And I am, no Paine scholar, but, Morris, I think one of the people who led the charge, and you and Gary can correct me if I'm wrong, in not defining Thomas Paine not seeing Thomas Paine as an American citizen and denying him the right to vote, if I have that right. So Gouverneur Morris also has one of my famous quotes about the Constitution, which is this idea that shortly after the convention, that nothing human can be perfect. And I'm sort of bastardizing it, but he said something around to the effect of nothing human can be perfect. We did the best we could, and we left it to future generations to essentially make it better and make it their own. And I know he's at odds with Thomas Paine about many things, but Thomas Paine also echoes this sentiment to a certain extent with his ideas shared by Thomas Jefferson and others about reconstitution. So, you know, I do think that when we think about somebody like James Madison, I do think he would say, the practical, pragmatic James Madison would say, we could change the system. And I would also just say, I am sensitive to the fact that for our framers, they wanted to allow us to change the Constitution, but to not be able to do it too much or too easily. And James Madison was particularly bent on that idea. So they made amendments very, very difficult. But they also understood that if you don't allow for change, the alternative to political change is violence. They themselves were a violent, for the most part, many of them had fought in the Revolutionary War or had been part of the revolution. They were a violent generation. They knew when people get fed up enough with their government, they will overthrow it. And so, you know, James Madison walked this very difficult line. And, you know, I don't pretend to know what he would say, but I imagine he would say we should think about peaceful structural changes, to do those in a way that makes sense, because if we don't, whether now or at some point in the future, people may get so fed up that they turn to violence. And America has a very, very violent history. And, you know, one of the fascinating things I stumbled across or knew about, but read more about in writing this book, was a whole school of thought that the only real change that's been made in the United States when it comes to structure has been via violent means. And there's a lot of disagreement on that, but some scholars who say that violence is as American as apple pie. And so to avoid that, as I know we all want to, you've got to allow for change to come. And we haven't had that in over 240 years when you come to structure, very much in the United States.
Thank you, and of course your comments about violence and it sort of being hardwired into the American nation, of course, and I'm sure this is true for many, makes me think of the events of January the 6th and the ways in which violence can be weaponized to be somewhat redundant. And it also makes me think, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the way in which media had a role to play in the founding structures and then the Madisonian style Republican democracy, which was enshrined in the Constitution and through the first party system, which you mentioned a little while ago, and how the role of media has changed, and the ways in which we can think about the media as both a disseminator of ideas, but in some ways a constructor of obstacles to the kind of political deal making, which is a part of the compromises and through which legislation gets passed today.
It's such a fascinating area. One of the things that I think, I'm not going too much out on a limb in saying, is that if we had the media that we have today back in 1787, we would not be living where we are under the US Constitution. You know, famously amongst the rules of the convention was that it was to be secret, it was to be private. And that was in large part for fear that if there were leaks to the very, very tough media at the time, and while they were primarily print and, you know, the pamphleting and those kinds of things, they were very, very vicious, that could have been the death knell of the attempt to amend the articles, or in fact revive, you know, offer a new constitution. And I have to say, I believe that that is true. And so they famously shut off the convention to the press and the public. And, you know, I just can't imagine that happening today. You know, I always use in class the example of in 1992, when Hillary Clinton was appointed by Bill Clinton to lead the healthcare reform. she did something that the framers did. She said, we're going to do this privately and then try to put out a bill or put out a plan, if you will, so that we have a plan to put forward. Because if we open it to all these voices, it's very difficult to get anything done. And she was widely criticized for that decision, as we all remember. And of course, not long after, Dick Cheney was appointed to do the energy revival. He does the same thing, same criticism. And I think it's gotten even worse since both of them were operating. And it's sort of the one, a real difficulty in a democracy. How do you get things done when the scrutiny is the spotlight is what it is? And so I think the benefit for the framers was that they were able to shut down the press for that period of time. And of course, at the time, they too were charged with being anti-democratic and not transparent and all of those things. But again, I can't imagine that happening today. And I don't imagine they would have gotten the document they got with the press if it had been like it is today. And that's not to say the press wasn't vicious at the time, because the party press was even more vicious than our press today. But it is to say that there wasn't as pervasive in our lives as it is today. If I could just add about the media today, because I often am asked about this, I do a lot of work with the media. I'm looking at the structure of the US government. We could say the same thing about the structure of the media in the United States. I think we have to be realistic about human nature. When you set up a media and its survival depends on human beings watching, listening, clicking on it, you are incentivizing them to move up the sort of stories about, sexual escapades and corruption and those kinds of things versus stories about boring public policy. And it's not that people in the media are bad or they don't care. It's that they too need to survive and they too need to thrive as a business. We don't like to consider this, but there is something to be said for public media. There is something to be said. While we have a very negative view in this country generally of state-sponsored and state-run media, and certainly for a good reason. One of the benefits of it is that they are not dependent on ratings. They are not dependent on eyeballs. So, if there was somewhere in between we could get to that point, I think we would all benefit. And something like NPR or PBS, they do a beautiful job of doing that, as we all know. But that's, of something to consider about the media, that they too have a structure that incentivizes behavior that results in the publication of material and the airing of material that's not necessarily to our public benefit. And yet there will be no stopping it as long as they're operating in a capitalist system. And so, people, very smart people, are trying to figure out ways to do that and address that. But it's a very difficult thing to do. And we were just talking on air the other day about couple that with the sort of death of the local news. I mean, you want to talk about, whatever corruption is going on in New York State government, where many of us are, many of us cannot get good local news, not just in New York, but across the country, because of the capitalist system in which we operate. It's very difficult to have a local news business that's thriving. Carl Hiaasen, the great author who just retired from the Miami Herald last week, wrote a brilliant op-ed. As you kill local news and no reporters are up there watching what's going on in Albany or any capital across the country or in the mayor's offices, corruption blooms. And so, from all of these perspectives, the media we have in our system is something that really needs to be addressed. And it's not an easy discussion to have, and there's no easy options, but it is something that's really important to how we're living today. And to me, its structure is a big part of the problem, not necessarily the people who are working within it.
Thanks so much. Your comments just remind me of the extent to which the idea that the media or the press should be theoretically objective, that's an expectation that we have today, even though so many of us know that it's not. But that basic idea did not exist in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the expectation that media would be uh, uh, unbiased politically. Just wasn't something that, right?
Yeah, these were, it's interesting. We always talk in class about the fact these were party presses, and they were anything but objective, as we know. They were vicious party presses. And the idea of objectivity that so many of us celebrate, I myself am not a huge proponent of it, but many people celebrate. Let's not forget that comes about as the result of a business decision. Once you get the APs of the world, the Associated Presses, they decide, rightly so, we can't be a conservative or liberal press and sell our stories because we'll be limiting who'll buy our stories. And that's what pushes this objectivity in media idea that comes about much, much later in American history. And since the mid 20th century has become sort of, held up as something that we should all, sort of reach to. And, I like objectivity as much as the next person, but we should be honest that it was a business decision on the part of the media. It was not because they had a public interest. And again, you get back then to structure. It's, a lot of people, because I've been at every network, conservative, liberal, and everywhere in between, if people will watch Cats, they will put them on. They are much more interested in the ratings than they are in the politics. And you can't stress that enough, because if people don't watch, they die. And so it's the structure of the system in which they're operating that needs to be looked at, as opposed to sort of who's working within the system.
Thank you. So as we've been talking, a question I hadn't initially planned on asking sort of popped into my head, and that's the brilliance of a conversation like this. It occurs to me that in your book, most of the primary characters or primary actors are elite to one degree or another, but elite white men: James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and rightfully so, of course, because so much of your book is about the founding moment and the political ideas and political theories which inform the creation of the American government. But as we also know, as historians know, and I think people with an interest in the 18th and early 19th century of the history of the United States know that there was I'll say skepticism. I think other words could be chosen. There was a skepticism on the part of the so-called founders of the people, doing air quotations, this undifferentiated mass of people who constituted most of the individuals living in the early United States. Can you talk a little bit about how the founders, but James Madison, since he's the sort of central character of your book, thought about the ways in which the United States government, as it was constituted in the late 18th century, conceived of the people, or maybe I could also call it conceived of common people, and how that has informed our political system through today?
It's really interesting because it is, again, things like Shays' Rebellion and other rebellions that are occurring, pre the convention, and during the, under the period in which we were under the Articles of Confederation, that James Madison and others begin to fear the people, this mob, as you talk about it. And I shouldn't say begin to, but realize that having settled on a free state, they are now vulnerable to the very people they've empowered or who have been empowered. And to me, that's a central part of this story. That's why they are so committed to protection of liberty, and in particular, the liberty to own property, is they want to be sure that this mob is unable to really wrest power away from them. As that I always remember first reading in grad school somebody like Charles Beard, and his economic interpretation of the Constitution. And it's a brilliant book, and for anybody who hasn't read it, but also the stories surrounding how when Charles Beard published that book, he was almost run out of academia for daring to suggest that the framers were motivated by economics or economic interest. And, you know, it's always been a little bit interesting to me, because the framers themselves were very clear that most people were motivated by self-interest. You know, that was what motivated people. So I don't know why anybody suspected they exempted themselves from that. And certainly, to Charles Beard's point, and it's a very well documented book, and you could argue that it's a bit reductionist and it maybe is too simplistic. They were also motivated, as Lowy and Ginsburg and others say, by, you know, principle and other things. And I think that there is truth to that. So, but there is an economic motive there, and it's clear in what they wrote and what they said. And I don't think that speaks ill of them. I think it speaks to the fact that they were, as Madison himself said, human beings and not angels. You know, you reread Federalist 51, and the brilliance of his commentary on human nature is important, and it reflects not just his view of people, but the framers themselves. So when you raise the question of how they saw people, I think that they feared what could potentially happen if there was an attempt to take power in a free state and use that power to do things like I mentioned before, redistribute wealth. And this is the same argument we're having today at this very moment, as we see, you know, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, other people talking about things like a wealth tax. You know, I'm a contributor at Bloomberg now. We spend all our time talking about taxation and all of these things. These are very, very difficult questions, and they're not new. How much inequality is out there? How much do you redistribute wealth? These are the same questions the framers were thinking about and reacting to and talking about, and they stay with us to this very day. So, you know, I think your question is very well placed. And, you know, one of the people that I always recommend that people read is a very short speech that I mentioned in the book by Thurgood Marshall, who at the bicentennial, the brilliant Thurgood Marshall gave a speech for, it was one of the bar associations, and he was on the Supreme Court at the time. And it was the bicentennial, so it was obviously a year when everybody was celebrating the founding and the founders. And in one of the best speeches, I think, of the 20th century, he stood up and said, much to many people's shock, was that he was not going to celebrate the founding or the founders. He was going to celebrate the Constitution as it has evolved over time, with a clear understanding that they had disenfranchised women, African Americans, that they had not created this city on a hill for the vast majority of the people reading or listening to his speech. And I think it's important to say that this is not an attack on the framers. I love the framers. I read them all the time, but it is the reality of what they did at the time. And his point is that it took a civil war, it took a civil rights movement, a women's rights movement, and we're not there yet, as we know from the last, year in particular. So I think it's important to be realistic about the framers. You know, we should respect what they did, but they were critical of themselves, and I think they would invite us to be equally critical of them, both the good that they did, and there's plenty of good to celebrate, and what could be perfected. And they were the first people to say a lot could be perfected. You know, you write a constitution in a couple months, 240 years later, you might want to rethink the structure of that.
Thank you. And I want to say we have about 10 minutes left in our conversation, and we'll leave about 30 minutes for Q&A. So folks at home, I guess we're all at home, but folks at home, if you want to ask a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A. There's already one, which we'll get to in a second. Or in the chat function, and we'll make sure that we get to it. You sort of in your last comments kind of anticipated the next question that I wanted to ask. So you're clairvoyant. The question is this: do you think there is too much, and I'm speaking of from the perspective of modern day 21st century America, do you think there's a danger in, I'll use the word danger, a danger in focusing too much on the founders and what they intended to do? Do you think that the founders, to use a common phrase, get used and abused in terms of modern day politics? Or do you think that we have a healthy and appropriate amount of recognition for the founders' handiwork?
I would never say we focus too much on the founders. I think we can't focus enough on them, but I think we can be more critical of what they did and do that in a respectful and collegial manner. Again, none of this is an attack on the founders or the United States or the system they created. It has so much to offer. But again, they were the first to say, you know, we did the best we could, but there's changes to be made, and they recognize that in allowing for amendments. I do think founders, not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world, get used and abused. And I also think that founders around the world, we tend to narrowly define our founders, and that's problematic. And I am guilty of that in this very text. You know, I'm focusing on James Madison, maybe, you know, to a certain extent, Thomas Jefferson and some of these major characters. I've got a lot of, you know, property owning white males in this book. There were other founders who are neglected in this text. So I think we have a tendency, human beings have a tendency, and I think in the educational system, particularly in grammar school and middle schools and high schools, we tend to reinforce this because one of the reasons we have public education, quite frankly, is to create good citizens. And how do you do that? Is you develop a respect for the system, a respect for the founders, so that you develop people who will go out and get jobs and pay taxes and all of those things. So, you know, there is an interest in promoting the founding and the founders. There's an interest in promoting patriotism, and I certainly understand that. One of the things I've had the real fortune of doing over the last 5 years is doing some research on the founding in the sort of another post-colonial founding, if you will, in India and Pakistan. And one of the things I've talked a little bit about is the forgotten founders over there. And these were men and women who, you know, certainly played a key role in the founding, but have not been recognized for their own political reasons in those countries. So I think it's a common thing that we do here. I think we should talk as much about these founders and the forgotten founders in the US, but I think we should be honest. And I think in those conversations, we should talk about what we could do to perfect or make better the system that they created. And to me, that's really the crux of the matter. I mentioned that this point I'm making goes back to Joseph's story, if not before. He's 1833. You know, Woodrow Wilson, you know, as a young man at Princeton, all the way through to his presidency. So many people spent their time making this case. One of my favorites, Lloyd Cutler, who worked for Jimmy Carter. And yet it's never permeated the public conscience. And Woodrow Wilson is, you know, the only political scientist who ever became president. So we sort of like him in political science, but he used to say that it was really difficult to make a discussion about structural change permeate the public consciousness because it's not very exciting. It's not interesting. It's not sexy, if you will, to talk about diminishing the divide between the executive and the legislative branch, or having, you know, a certain number of cabinet members chosen from the Senate. You know, those are sort of boring topics. And yet until we have that discussion and you change the system, all of the other discussions fall by the wayside. One thing that sort of motivated me to write this that I didn't mention is the amount of people who contact me, very good active citizens who contact me and say they're working to get a new person or a different person elected to office. And I think that's critically important. By the same token, we focus so much attention in this country, in the media, on changing who's in office, term limits. If we get rid of this president and replace him or her with this president, things will be different. And there is truth. Individuals matter and they make a difference, but they are still operating in the same system. And there's only so much impact they could have. I often, one of my colleagues, Michael Genovese, who's a political scientist, makes a really good point. He quotes this management guru, Peter Drucker, who I like a lot. And he says, if year after year, the CEO of your company, you're getting one, they're failing. And these were good, honest people coming into a position, and you're replacing them with somebody else and they're still failing. The problem may not be the person, it may be the system in which you're putting the seat of power in which you're putting them. And Michael Genovese uses that to talk about the presidency and says, in the modern era in particular, our presidents have either failed or failed to live up to expectation. It's not because we are getting horrible, dumb, miserable people. Some of them we like, some we don't. But the reality is probably we're asking them to work in a structure that needs to be reformed and revised. And so again, for a lot of these people I talk to who want to change who's in office, I think that's great. But we should have a little bit of conversation to match that about changing the structure in which we're going to put those people. Otherwise, you're going to put people in the system, and by and large, their ability to make change is going to be not much better than the person that they're succeeding.
Thank you. And you this will be my last question, and we already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, but and we'll get to those in a second. So if you were all powerful, let's say that you were the James Madison of the 21st century, you had an opportunity to reform the system or revise the system to make it more responsible to American citizens' desires, self-interested as American citizens can be. And I think that's an important point that you made earlier. If you were all powerful, if you could control the strings, if you could be the puppet master, in an ideal world, obviously, what would your in what ways would you reform or revise the structure of American governance?
Yeah, and I think it's not just Americans. I think many human beings are self-interested. You know, God bless the ones who are not. They're, you know, they're fewer and further between than we wish they were.
That's true. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to discriminate against
yeah,
that.
No. Never. You know, I think the number one. So, you know, I talk a lot in the last part of the book about potential reforms, and they really fall into a couple buckets. One are, you know, using the amendment process. Another is an Article 5 constitutional convention, which has its own sort of, you know, dangers attached to it. And another are what we think of as extra constitutional changes. You know, on the first bucket, we've had very, very few amendments in American history, only 12 since the Civil War. And 2 of those canceled each other out in terms of prohibition. So we've really only had 10. Very few of those have been structural. Most have been importantly about things like voting rights, which are critically important. So I'm not convinced that, nor am I convinced in this sort of atmosphere, we could get the support we need to make constitutional changes. I don't think many people are comfortable with an Article 5 constitutional convention for real reasons. So I think we're looking at extra constitutional sort of changes. So these would be things like, and there's a ton of proposals out there. John Weil, who's a wonderful historian, has written a ton of books on this. But these would be things like incentivizing the executive and the Congress to work together by diminishing the amount of divide or gap between them, to use a word twice. So we have a huge division between the executive and the legislative branches. So one way to sort of mitigate that is to incentivize them to work together. So this would be things like have the president choose a third or half of his cabinet from the Senate. Or another idea that's been talked a lot about is to have the president and the Senate and the House, or the House, elected on a party platform, if you will, elected together. And there's so many other ideas like this that have been bandied about for the last 200 years. But the idea with all of them is, some people describe it as pseudo-parliamentary. I'm not sure it's quite pseudo-parliamentary, but the idea is diminish the division between that's built into the system and incentivize these individuals and who occupy these offices, whoever they may be, to work together. So I think that's one way to go. Another thing would be something like the responsible party model. So one of my favorite political scientists that I talk a lot about in the book is E.E. Schatzschneider, was a wonderful political scientist from Wesleyan University. And he's my favorite. And he talked about this a lot. He worked with several political scientists in the mid 20th century to write a famous piece for the American Political Science Association about responsible parties. And the idea there is that if we can't make constitutional structural changes, make the political parties more responsible and responsive. And they had a variety of reform ideas for doing that. You know, I grew up in Connecticut, and when I was a young person, we had, we had a party lever. And that, has gone by the wayside now. And a lot of people don't like that. Students always say, oh, I vote for the person. Well, okay, but if you're in a system this divided, you might be better off voting for a party if it's responsible. So party levers are another idea people talk about. So there's a lot of reform ideas, but I think for my purposes, I think extra constitutional means of incentivizing the executive and the legislative to work together would be sort of my first go-to reform.
Thank you, and those sound great to me. I have to say, but I think we're all sort of maybe perhaps slightly traumatized from the last year, especially.
Yeah.
Now I want to get to a couple of the questions from the audience, and I'll start with Barbara Crane's fantastic question. And Barbara writes, as partisan identification generally diminishes, what about the role in our democratic system of broad social movements? And some of the social movements that Barbara mentions are Black Lives Matter, gun control movements, and earlier movements like the Civil Rights Movement and gay rights. So how do social movements sort of fit into your the story that you tell in your book about the struggle that the founders and the framers had to balance so many competing interests and translate that into a government?
So much work has been done on the social movements, and Barbara's point, I should say, that you raised at the beginning, or she put in the chat room, party identification is way down, and for good reason. That I wouldn't say it's been replaced by, but certainly people find, what Madison said was human nature. They have found other ways in which to coalesce and join together in social movements. And of course, that's been done since the founding. But there was a period of time where a lot of people found that in the political parties, but as the role of the parties has diminished to a certain extent, we've seen social movements thrive. From my perspective, one of the challenges there is that, again, our system is not designed. You have what I think of as sort of a break, or there's a disjoint, it's a disjointed sort of reality, which is that outside of government, those social movements matter an awful lot. But in government, so in Congress, they're organized by political parties to a large extent. And so I think we do need to think about, if we aren't going to turn to political parties to govern, and if we can't revitalize them and restructure them, is there a way to restructure our system so that that energy at the social movement level is brought to the governing level? And I think we see some inklings of that, and we even see some of it in government, but I don't think we see enough of it. And so I think what occurs is that people again feel kept out of the governing process, or they don't feel like their voices matter as much as they should. And I think that's frustrating. And so, of course, they then turn to alternative means to make change, which is demonstrations and protests, which are, you know, when they're peaceful, are absolutely wonderful and important. But you'd also like to see that energy be able to filter its way into the government. But our Congress is just not structured that way at the federal level or at most of the state levels. And so I think that's a shame. The one other thing I would just say about movements, which is something I mentioned before, interest groups traditionally in the US have been, you know, really something that people of means have had the chance to do. But I think one of the new exciting things and the positive things about new technology is with the social media, we've seen that the ability of people who may not have a lot of money, who may not have a lot of time, who may have young families or be working or going to school, they've been able to make their voices heard through social media in a way that wasn't possible even 20, 30 years ago. So what has been in my field, sort of the idea that, you know, young people or people on the lower end of the economics, socioeconomic status spectrum are kept out of interest groups, has seemed in my, you know, at least in the research I've seen of late, to have changed in part as a result of social media. So it's one of the really wonderful things about social media, but I think we need to do a better job of joining that with an ability to translate that into a policy-making perspective, and that still hasn't found its way into Congress yet, in part, I would say, because it is so expensive to run for office and win in the United States, and we've not seen viable campaign finance reform.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at Judith Clark's comment in the chat. What about a new constitutional convention? That might be, that could be a starting point. It also makes me think, you know, you mentioned social media and the ways in which that has been a fundamental transformation in obviously communication, but the ways in which people can connect together to forward these social movements. And in my own historian reveries, I often think, you know, what would the founding generation, what would have happened if the founding generation had access to social media? Who would have been the most vociferous tweeter?
Thomas Paine, maybe. I think.
I think Thomas Paine would have been firing off tweets left and right all day.
I agree with you. And can I just say, on it was Judith, right? On Judith, about a constitutional convention. That's this whole issue. There is a whole movement for an Article 5 constitutional convention, and there's a lot of people working on that. There's also a lot of fear, you know, who would go to it? How do we know it would, you know, would it be a runaway convention is a fear where, you know, they just tackle everything under the sun. So there's a lot of fear and trepidation attached to that. But I should say they've had some wonderful conferences. I'm thinking of one, I think it was in 2014 at Harvard, about an Article 5 constitutional convention. So I don't think it's a really crazy idea. And I mentioned Thomas Paine, you know, he and Thomas Jefferson didn't, you know, they talked about the reconstitution idea, which is a little bit different, but that is the idea that every periodically 20 or 30 years, the citizens of the state or the nation get a chance to say, is this thing working? Is it not? Should we have a convention? Shouldn't we? You know, that's not a bad idea. And Paine and Jefferson were two of the many people at the founding who pushed for that. But of course, Madison was not a fan, and we don't have that, although many states do have a reconstitution.
You know, I noticed that you, in your book, you quoted Thomas Paine from the 1786 public letter that he wrote, which is one of the works of Thomas Paine that is not well known, partially because he wrote so much, but
Yeah.
the idea, and I think about this a lot myself, and I think it kind of feeds back into this idea about a new constitutional convention and ways to reform American governance. But as you mentioned, right, his idea that he went pretty far in suggesting that every 30 years, all laws should be wiped off the books because the dead should not have any purchase on the living. And I think about that all the time. And I think, and again, one of my reveries, think about how different things could be if that were true. Of course, it's not. Another
And
question.
Thomas Jefferson echoed that, and their disagreement was about what constitutes a generation. Should it be 19 years or should it be, so they were debating about the size of the generation, the number of years, but they agreed very much on this idea that you should not be governed beyond the grave, or governing beyond the grave was, I think, the quote. There shouldn't be an idea of a perpetual governance or perpetual constitution, because it does put future generations in chains. And both Paine and Jefferson made that case. And it can be overstated, but it also is something I think we have to think about.
Yeah, thank you. And there's a question from an anonymous attendee, and it's a great question. And it's asking you, would you argue that rethinking Madisonian government, which is, of course, the major theme of your book, inward focused as it seems, is also imperative to having a robust and more effective foreign policy? So how does this rethinking Madisonian government, how might that influence ways of thinking about foreign policy?
It's such a good point. And it's funny because I was just thinking about this. I don't know if people probably saw, I don't know, that yesterday or the day before, Tom Friedman of the New York Times wrote a really good piece in the wake of the meeting between our new Secretary of State and his counterpart in Alaska, his counterpart from China in Alaska. And we all saw how, how publicly tough their comments to each other were. And then we're told that they actually made a little progress, maybe. But Friedman wrote this piece in which, of all people, he started off talking about Bill Maher and, people who watch Bill Maher. And Bill Maher basically made the case, and I'm, not quoting him exactly, that China is eating our lunch. In part, Bill Maher said, because, by the way, this week is Infrastructure Week, and Bill Maher said, we've been having an Infrastructure Week every year since 2009, and we have no infrastructure bill and none in the offing. And he made the case that, China is feeling emboldened vis-a-vis the United States because, in Bill Maher and Tom Friedman's sort of understanding, they are able to get things done in the way we can't in the United States. And infrastructure is just one of many examples you can think of. And I was particularly struck by that because, the reality is that it does impact us on the foreign policy stage. And that's but one example. China is able to make great inroads, and not to talk so much about the New York Times, but again, a few weeks ago, they had a great piece on the sort of how China has made Germany and, sort of dependent on them, for lack of a better term. They're doing similar work with the Silk Road as it pertains to Asia and their work in Africa. And in part, I think if we take a step back, we can see why that is, because they can move more quickly and efficiently to pursue a policy agenda than we ever could. And I mentioned one of the people I talk a lot about in the book, Lloyd Cutler. He worked for Jimmy Carter, and he wrote a really important piece for Foreign Affairs I think in 1980, which he called To Form a Government. And Lloyd Cutler made the case, you know, we are living in a system in which Jimmy Carter ran for office, making all the promises presidents do. He negotiates SALT II with our sworn enemy, the Soviet Union, and yet he brings that over to the United States and he can't get his own Senate to approve it. And Cutler says, how can we make foreign policy if we can negotiate with sworn enemies, but a president can't get something through his own legislature? And so Cutler goes on to make a number of reform proposals to bridge the gap again between the executive and the legislative branch. And you know, it's a perennial story that goes on about the frustrations our executives feel. And I should say, you know, as we leave the Trump era and we're in the Biden era, it's very easy when you like the president to say they should have more power. And it's a very uneasy feeling when you don't like the president to make that case. But I think we have to be intellectually honest and say, the president, the executive branch, not well designed by the framers from the Electoral College on down. It's one of the areas in which Madison was not on sure footing, and he admitted that. And we have a very, very institutionally, structurally weak president who is forced to turn to things like executive orders to get things done that can then be turned over by the next president. And as we say, that is no way to run a democracy. So that's a very long-winded way of answering that question, but foreign policy is a huge component of this in so many capacities.
Thank you. And we have time for a couple more questions. So if anybody wants to drop them in the Q&A, again, please feel free. In the meantime, I have a question for you. And it's been sort of hovering around my mind for this entire talk. And your last comment about the structural weakness of the United States executive branch sort of brought me back to this question. In your experience as a professor, in your experience with the media, teaching, what would you say is if you had to choose one, so I'm going to put you on the spot here, the single biggest misperception that Americans today, if we're going to generalize, but the single biggest misperception that Americans today have about the intentions of the founding generation, the framers of the Constitution? So again, you can say more than one if you want.
Yeah, you know, you've restricted me, Michael. I think the biggest misconception, I would say, this idea that I would say the thing we don't understand as well as we should about our own framers was their commitment to the protection of property. And I think it explains an awful lot about how we live today, because the structure, as I mentioned, hasn't changed that much. And, you know, a piece that I wrote not long ago for the Fulcrum, you know, Americans today, at least according to the polling, don't agree on the goal of a democracy or a free state. You know, some people have very different views, and we saw that reflected in the 2020 election on the Democratic side, as you saw Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and other Democrats arguing for things like government-run healthcare versus other Democrats like a Pete Buttigieg or a Joe Biden, Amy Klobuchar, arguing for a more, you know, a different type of system, sort of a mixed public and private system, if you will. And that's reflective of the American public as a whole. We don't agree on the goal. Some theorists say the goal is to create good citizens, but we should understand that for our framers, it was to protect the liberty to own property and other liberties. And if your goal is to protect property, you design the system to do that, and the system then works the way we have it today. I mean, another misconception I would say about the framers, or I don't know if it's a misconception, but something, they succeeded incredibly well in what they set out to do. They succeeded too well in my mind. And I think we've come to a point where those scales of accountability and responsiveness need to be balanced with protectionism. And I think there are ways to do that. But, you know, I love that when James Madison bemoaned the fact to Thomas Jefferson in a letter after the convention, they hadn't done enough to protect liberty at the convention, that this wasn't going to work. And of course, as we know today, in a system that by and large, even in a time of crisis, in a pandemic, it's very difficult to get support to respond to the majority. They succeeded so well in giving the minority an outside voice that responding to majorities has become incredibly difficult. And I think we are all suffering to a certain extent as a result of that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in my own research and many other historians' research, that tension between liberty and property, right, the sort of Lockean idea, life, liberty, property being translated in the Declaration of Independence into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But that tension between trying to protect one while forwarding the others, I suppose one could say the sort of central paradox of American history.
Yeah.
There's another question about foreign policy, but specifically about foreign businesses wanting to operate in the United States today. And the question is, what would you say is a political risk for foreign businesses wanting to operate in the United States today?
You know, I think it depends in part on the type of business when we think about risk. But I do think that, you know, one that comes to mind is the fact that we have over the in the modern era, we have been changing party control fairly regularly. So we don't know what will happen in 2022, of course, but in the modern era, it has become all that much more common that in the midterm, the party of the president loses seats, or in fact loses one or both houses. And that creates, again, more division in our system. We've seen that, and also increasingly amounts of divided government. So I think, you know, for foreign businesses operating here, what that means is then a tendency to not be sure what type of policies, everything from regulation to taxes and everything else, are going to come down the pike. So I think there is an uncertainty, or I should say a lack of continuity to a certain extent, that can make it challenging for foreign businesses operating in the US. And I think, you know, as we think about that, that's one of the risks. There's also, you know, when we think about risk, there's also, you know, a lot to be offered in the United States, and a lot of very positive things to be offered as foreign businesses come over here. So, you know, I don't want to use risk all in the negative sense. I think another, you know, challenge is again back to the issue of campaign finance, which is that it's expensive to have influence in our system. I think that's why so many people talk about campaign finance reform. And so, you know, big corporations certainly have the financial wherewithal to do that. But if you are a smaller entity wanting to operate in the United States, it's an expensive proposition to have influence in our system at the state, local, and federal level. So I think that's another challenge. And of course, the amount of regulation, labor costs, you know, you just go down the list. So there's a lot of them, but I think that there are some, those are some of the big ones that come to mind.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that the founding generation couldn't anticipate the ways in which money would influence elections to the extent that they do now. And yet another one of the later developments that get connected to the founding fathers in some ways, but which they're, I think, not necessarily responsible for. So we have a couple minutes, and I'll just sort of ask one final question. You mentioned E.E. Schnattschneider, excuse me.
Schatzschneider, yep.
Schatzschneider,
a very long name.
The political scientist who you mentioned throughout your book, and you say is one of your biggest inspirations. And I had to dig through my copy, but can you reflect on a quotation of Schatzschneider's, if I pronounce that correctly, that I think you use a couple of times in the book as a way of sort of closing this. And this is from a 1975 book by Schachtschneider, in which he wrote, quote, "Democracy was made for the people, not the people for democracy." What do you think he meant by that?
There is an entire school of thought, which we've seen even recently has gotten a lot of attention, that there's a political psychologist named Sean Rosenberg who just got a lot of attention in the press recently for a piece he wrote called "Devouring Democracy." And Rosenberg, it's a really good piece, and Rosenberg's point was that democracies around the world are failing and faltering. And as a political psychologist, he attributes the failure of democracy largely to something that many people have talked about and is absolutely true. And this goes back to, you know, Socrates and Aristotle, which is that the people are too ignorant and incompetent to rule themselves. So there's a long history of this, and you don't have to look very far at the polls to show that most people are wild. Most of us, not just people, all of us are wildly ignorant. So there is truth to that, and I mean ignorant when it comes to their government and specific policies and those kinds of things. So one of the things that Schachtschneider was famous for saying was that he was very critical of studies that would show the American people as ignorant, because he was famous for saying that you don't build a democracy for the way you hope people will be. You build a democracy for the way people are. And we know people are too busy with their own lives, busy working, raising children, going to school, to know everything about the ins and outs of domestic and public policy and politics and government. So he wanted to make the case, don't expect people to be, you know, all Socrates. And if you're building a government in which that's your expectation, then you're the problem. He wanted there to be a democracy in which you limit what you expect of the people. And so my very favorite book of his is a book called The Semi-Sovereign People. And it's subtitled A Realist View of Democracy in America. And his point in that was, democracies are not making people sovereign, they're semi-sovereign, meaning that all you need to know is enough to elect representatives who are serving you well and to throw them out when they're not. You don't need to pass some kind of quiz and be an all-knowing, you know, Socrates to be a citizen in a democracy. So the quote that you gave is one, I think, in which he's reflecting that idea, which is, please, democratic theorists, let's be realistic about what we expect of people. And this is something I think, you know, has really had an impact on me, because I think a lot of times we're unrealistic. You know, we expect people to behave in a way that doesn't suit their interests. We expect them to behave in a way that most people just don't. And so I think that's where I'm always focused on structure. Build the structure to incentivize the behavior that most people, that incentivizes the behavior you want. Try as much to mitigate bad behavior as you can. And don't expect people, to Madison's point, to be angels. Most people aren't. Most people are self-interested and selfish, or many people are. You want to build a system in which those people, if they get into power, can't harm us, and that they can do the work they need to do. And so I think that's where Schachtschneider was coming from. He wanted a more realistic type of democracy that could operate in the modern era, as opposed to this sort of Greek city-state idealistic model, which many of us have in our head, but doesn't really work so well. And by the way, when it worked, it was only because they had slaves and women at home to do the work, so they could sit in the town square all the time and debate about politics. So it's just unrealistic as you extend the franchise.
Thank you. And it's now 8:30 and we're drawing to a close. But can I just ask one more question quickly?
Yeah.
We'll sneak it in. And it's actually an adaptation of a comment by Malva Ubben. So thank you, Malva. Just a sort of a final note. The sort of realism that you speak of, inspired by Schachtschneider, if I can say that name correctly, in terms of a realistic view about how American governance could possibly be reformed in the future, do you think we should be pessimistic about the prospect of changes to the structure of the United States government in the future, or should we think more optimistically about changes that are possible?
I think, conversations like this are a reason to be optimistic. There's a lot of people, and I think one of the really good things in the last year or so that I've at least personally seen is a lot of interest in reform in a variety of ways. And so I think the more we can have conversations like this and bring to life people like Joseph Story and Lloyd Cutler and others who have all these ideas for reform, the better off we'll be. I think one of my fears is that discussions of structural reform in the US have traditionally followed periods of crisis like we've been in, or anniversaries like the bicentennial. And unfortunately, when you move through those peacefully, people sort of forget and other things take over. So, one of the things I hope is that the crisis we're in and we've been going through reminds us as we move forward, we don't forget about the need to make sure that we take seriously the necessity of reform, because I do think there's a lot of energy out there for it. So I think you said it was Malva. I am cautiously optimistic because of conversations like this. So I'm grateful to you, Michael and Gary and Nora, for the opportunity, because I think it's important.
And we're grateful for you, to you for being with us tonight. So thank you so much, Dr. Sheehan. It's been our pleasure. Thank you so much to everybody in the audience. This is a fantastic series, this collaboration between the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies and the Huguenot and New Rochelle Historical Society. If you want to learn more, please consider purchasing Dr. Sheehan's book, American Democracy in Crisis, The Case for Rethinking Madisonian Government. That's through Palgrave Macmillan as the publisher, and you can find it at all good booksellers. So thank you very much for being with us tonight. And thank you everybody for joining us. Be safe, be healthy, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.